Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome again to one of your favorite shows, or at least I hope your favorite show. We're back again, Friday Drinks. It's the two of us.
Yeah, Ranga is away, looking at a lot of water and relaxing.
Okay.
So
is he trying to tell us something? Should we just take over the production as well?
So we're gonna have a bit of fun when the cat's away. The mice play.
Yeah, definitely.
So I'm very excited about this episode and this bottle.
Okay. What are you actually having?
Well, it's I like whiskeys that are smoky, peaty, and I also like whiskeys that are sweet. And it's rare to actually find a Scotch that's got both characteristics. And this Talisker from the Isle of Skye has both, and it is rated very highly by my whiskey Bible. So I'm quite excited. And yeah, it's a pity.
Tell me something, Rufaro. Where do you buy your whiskey from in Harare?
Well,
we're not going to advertise the place, but I'm just wondering if you actually find these bottles around. Or do you have runners who come in?
No, these bottles are actually quite available in Zimbabwe.
Supermarkets?
Not supermarkets, but specialized bottle stores. I think that we have developed an interesting palate in Zimbabwe, and 10 years ago you couldn't actually find a bottle like this anywhere in Harare. Mm-hmm. But now I can probably say there's 3 or 4 places you can go and find quite an impressive collection, and discover new whiskies, which you could never do. I think most people who were interested in whiskey 10 years ago, plus their only access to anything interesting was in duty free or somewhere outside the country. Yeah, so we definitely have made.
Is it safe to assume? Is it safe to assume that you've made somebody very rich over the last 10 years or so?
No, I don't think I've made anyone rich.
Wherever you're buying these bottles from, I mean.
And remember, a lot of these are very generous gifts from my fans.
Okay, all right. Well, there you go. I'm having a latte. The coffee is Tanganda. So
boring.
Yeah. I need a dose of coffee actually. It's been one of those.
It's been a long day.
Yeah, a long week actually. And we still have problems. Just bear with us. As far as electricity is concerned, we do have a bit of a challenge. Apparently, it's overcast and it's cold in Harare, so our solar may pack out, and we've got the generator running. But hopefully, that should be enough. But Zesa has decided to go elsewhere.
Sadly.
All right. So the purpose of this particular show is Shumba and I are going to do something that we haven't done before, which is we're actually going to agree. All right?
We agree a lot on capitalism, but I think there's some specifics for Zimbabwe where we disagree violently, I think.
Yeah. Well, the nuances. But really what we're going to do is perhaps put a Stillman's argument of a capitalist manifesto, and I say manifesto advisedly, but really what a capitalist society would look like, especially when we're in this season where it's electioneering, and we've seen a number of our political parties put out their plans, put out their manifestos, and argue what the next 5 years should be. But I think we have our own ideas on what the next 5 years should look like. And I think this is a fantastic platform. We've done this for a number of years. And this might be a particular day where we actually enunciate our own positions, our very strong positions, most of which we agree on. And we'll get into the nuances. Some of the nuances might be different, and that's when we'll get into a rabbit hole. But what we're trying to do with this particular episode is perhaps really push hard and get you to think, get you to recognize what capitalism might actually look like in Zimbabwe, and what we think the economy would look like if it was run on capitalist principles. We are ardent, and we make no apologies whatsoever about our belief system. I think that we sort of agree. Well, not sort of, but totally agree that the only way we can develop, especially Africa, is through the capitalist route. I think everywhere across the world, the only way that countries have developed is through capitalism. And perhaps to just actually kick off, this is a nice place to start. So Shumba, there's this argument that we continuously hear, and we need to debunk it, but we need to debunk it by actually, espousing what we totally believe in. And the argument is a lot of these rich nations are welfare states, or they have some sort of welfareism to where it's free education, free healthcare, and one or two other services that are for free, and these are rich nations. But when they were developing, when they were poor nations, they never had those. I mean, if you look at the NHS, that started in 1949. Britain was already a rich nation. Why should we borrow, or why should we take a lot of these rich nations' ideas and put them and impress them on a very poor state?
Yeah,
would you like to
it doesn't
take
make
a
any
bash at
sense.
that? Huh?
It doesn't make any sense.
What would our vision look like?
So I think in the first instance, you want to get to a place where we stop being poor and we become rich, right? Because once you're rich, you then have the luxury of seriously considering some of these welfare options, if it makes sense. But if we develop and we move from being poor to being rich in a way similar to, say, a nation like Singapore, it's not a welfare state. Everybody's got a medical insurance account, and they actually fund their own healthcare, and it works. Right? They've got higher medium household income in Singapore than they do in the US. So I think we have the luxury of looking at the historical record and comparing different case studies and wrapping our brains around what makes the most sense in a Zimbabwean context. But when we talk about welfare in Zimbabwe, I think what we must all acknowledge are some of the facts on the ground, which is that we are poor. We actually don't have the money.
And how are you defining poor? Maybe for the audience, they might have different ideas. How are you defining poor?
I did some numbers recently. So if you look at the annual budget of Zimbabwe, it's about 3.5 billion. And if you look at the population, right, we're at 16 million 16 million people. So what is that per capita? Now, if we, I did a bit of numbers the other day, and I looked at the school-going population, which is about 6.1 million people, right? If we spent our entire national budget on schooling, it would be less than $600 per child per year. Now, are you going to get world-class outcomes on $600 per child per year? And certainly our government is not in a place where it can spend every penny it gets on education, right? What's actually available realistically is much smaller than the $600 number. So when we talk about free education, it's a pipe dream. The money just isn't there.
Okay.
I mean,
I'd love to add on that, and I would like to look at the text as well, and perhaps attack this from a economic normative statement, and say that who decides that education is what we actually need to focus on? I mean, if you think about it, should that decision be made by society at top level, or it should be a bottoms-up decision? Let people make that decision, whether education is a priority or jobs. Remember, economics is trying to sort out the scarcity problem. So The problem is we have all these wants, all these needs, all these things that we would love to have. But unfortunately, we don't have the resources, and we have to make the best of our resources. And economics is really around optimizing our resources. So I put it to you, if you look at our tax system, and we've got two positions that we could perhaps take. The one position is, let's increase our taxes so that we have a welfare state where we provide free healthcare and free education. That's option number one. Option number two is, well, let's reduce our taxes and let's increase investment. Let people come into the country and invest in businesses and increase our employment numbers. So we reduce our taxes. It results in us earning far less, or getting far less in terms of tax revenue.
Not us, the government.
The government earning far less in terms of revenue, or getting far less in terms of revenue, but creating an enabling environment for lots and lots of business, mines, agriculture, manufacturing, to increase employment. And once people have jobs, then they can afford to decide whether education is something that they really want. Because I think it's a nanny state for someone, to sit in an ivory tower and say that education must be a public good. Who decides that? But I think once you have your own income, once you have a job and you're earning your own income, then if indeed education is a priority and health is a priority, then you've got the means to do so. So I put it to you that with those, and I want to put it to our audience, our Zimbabwean audience particularly, that which would you rather have? Increase taxes, so the number of taxpayers are fixed, you increase your taxes, you become unviable for investment, but you can somewhat provide free education, albeit very minimal free education, according to your numbers, or we reduce our taxes, so we actually receive less in terms of revenue, right? Because we're giving all this, we're giving all these allowances to investment to actually come to Zimbabwe. We increase employment numbers, and once people are employed, then they can afford to send their kids to school or actually have kids, right? You're not forced to have kids, by the way.
So I think what you're speaking to touches on an important philosophical question, which is the role of government in society in the first instance, right? Which is, and do you want a small government or a big government, and why? So and what kind of national mindset do you want? Do you want to build a society in which citizens feel responsible for their own lives, they have agency for their lives, or you want to build a society in which the citizen is forever looking to the state to solve their problems, to send their kids to school, to make sure that to treat them when they're unwell, to provide them with housing, to provide them literally with everything? What kind of state, what kind of society do you actually aspire to live in? And I think I'm libertarian in my philosophical outlook, and I think that the government should only do things that citizens can't sort out for themselves. Anything that a citizen can actually sort out for themselves should not be the government's business. And I think that to come back to your question around taxes, right? A society in which individuals take responsibility for the outcomes in their lives, that believe that they have agency in their life, you want to pay as little tax as possible, because you're not expecting the state to solve your problems. You're expecting to solve your own problems. And a low-tax society is also great for investment and for economic growth.
Where do you think it's coming from, this idea of the state as a charity organization? I mean, people literally, and these are people who are well-to-do, they look at the state as a charity organization.
So that's a great question, and I think it comes to, part of the answer is explains why the idea of socialism and communism is so seductive. Because there's this idea that life should be fair, right? That we should, not only are we all equal, we should all literally have equal life outcomes. We should, have access, we should live in the same kind of accommodation, we should all send our kids to the same kind of schools, we all deserve the same kind of healthcare. And on paper, it sounds like a fantastic egalitarian society, a kind of utopia. But in reality, every time that it's actually been tried, it's failed abysmally. So the idea is seductive, and I think sometimes
But where's the seduction? I'm not seduced at all.
Well, I think you've had the opportunity to look at the historical evidence. I think Winston...
No, I'm actually trying to look at it from a simpleton and from a common man's perspective. Like, where's the seduction? I mean, there's a bit of responsibility that comes with, you deciding what you want to do with your own money. So where's the seduction where I have to stand in a queue so that some guy, typically a politician, will give me or will decide whether or not I get a handout. And I go back home to my wife and say, it's been a very successful day. I stood in the queue and I got a voucher so my kid can go to school. Like, where's the honor in that? Where's the seduction in that? Because I actually think that society, the way society is built, the honor is a good day's work. Good day's work. Equal opportunity. Those that do not have the ability or the opportunity to actually work, what are we doing as society to actually ensure that they find work? What's the use in educating people and they cannot find jobs? And I think that as a society, this idea that this is very, seductive, as if it's some sexy woman, walking down the avenues and we're somewhat seduced. I'm not seduced at all, but I think that it's been packaged by, prophets and politicians in such a way that people are no longer thinking anymore. People do not, fundamentally understand that we have a scarcity problem. They think that we're rich because we've got resources, when that's not true. So how do you get those resources off the ground? And the only way you get those resources off the ground is by investment. And where you're going to get that investment from? You're going to have to lower your taxes, because you're competing with Mozambique, you're competing against Zambia, you're competing against other 250 nations of the world. And you don't have rule of law. You don't have good principles to actually, inculcate and ensure that savings and investments are safe in your country. But you still want education to be free. I think it's absolute bollocks. And if I'm being very honest, the people who usually give us these ideas are people who are sitting, academics and pseudo intellectuals who are sitting in ivory towers, who are telling poor people what they need. Most poor people, and I've had the privilege of actually working in rural Zimbabwe and rural Africa with a number of NGOs. Most poor people, they do not find any honor whatsoever in getting a handout. They would rather produce, and they would rather earn a fair and equitable, if I were to use that word, price for their products. They don't mind moving from maize to tobacco as the market dictates, right? So if you look at tobacco, you now have about 120, 150,000 farmers, small-scale farmers, with the option. So there's one option. One option is wait for the NGO to come and give you money. Or
food.
Or food. Or the other is farm tobacco, earn a living, and pay for your school kids. Most Zimbabweans, and here I'm talking about rural Zimbabwe, most rural Zimbabwe would rather work for their means. They do not find any honor whatsoever in standing in a queue for a handout. And I want to make this point even clearer. If you look at the number of people, the number of Zimbabweans who have actually left Zimbabwe to go and work in South Africa, they work in some of the most atrocious conditions in South Africa. But they have the option of staying in Cholosho and getting a handout. But they would rather, for their own honor, they would rather be an illegal immigrant. I mean, do you know what that means, being an illegal? So that they can earn an honest day's work. So for a new government to come in and tell us that actually we're going to provide things for free, I don't think that is really innate in Zimbabweans. What Zimbabweans want to do is they want jobs. They want to be able to earn a living. And I think that a capitalist manifesto, and manifesto I use it very advisedly, is a capitalist manifesto is how do we create jobs? And if we're going to create jobs, then we're going to have to reduce our taxes. We're going to have to make this environment very conducive for business. And if you make it conducive for business, if you make it conducive for a return, you can put in your money in Zimbabwe and you can take your money out, then the big mining companies are going to come here and we can easily create the 2-3 million jobs that we require. And from those jobs, people will be able to get healthcare, to get the sort of sustenance that they need. Sorry for that rant.
No. I couldn't agree more with what you've been saying. And I think that if you look at history across the world, any society that has emancipated the vast majority of its population from poverty has done so through free market capitalism. So if we start with the West and the Industrial Revolution that started in 1760, most people in Western Europe, in the US, were poor. 90% of the population in that part of the world lived in abject poverty for most of the history of civilization. It's only a relatively recent phenomenon that they earn high per capita incomes and enjoy what we call first world quality of life. It's literally 150 to 200 years that they've been at a place where they've enjoyed that kind of quality of life. Before that, 90% of the people were poor. They're not just poor, they lived in what we would today call abject poverty. So what happened in the Industrial Revolution, right? Where you had these economies basically explode. You had industry that didn't exist emerging, and those GDPs literally grew by orders of magnitude. So it's not like there was a transfer of wealth from a small elite that had most of the value in that economy to the masses. Actually, the pie grew very quickly and became so much bigger that those who previously didn't have much had a lot more than they previously had. And so that's the Industrial Revolution. That's 200-300 years ago. But in the modern era, post-World War II, for example, in 1960, Zimbabwe actually had a bigger economy than Singapore. Singapore was a rural backwater. It was poor, right? And if you fast forward today, it's a first world country with some of the best quality of life on the planet. How did they achieve this? They embraced free market capitalism. There was no wealth to be transferred from an elite to the poor masses. Yeah. They actually had to grow the economy from being tiny to being bigger than most African economies. And Singapore it's a city-state. It's on less than 1,000 square kilometers. To put that into context, Zimbabwe is on around 377,000 square kilometers, right? And we have almost every natural resource you can imagine, whether it's iron, platinum, gold, lithium.
Okay, so we'll get into wealth creation and how nations become wealthy. But the one thing that I wanted to highlight about capitalism that perhaps the audience may not understand is that capitalism is about mass production for the masses. It's mass production for mass consumption, right? And when you look at poor America or poor Europe, what people don't realize is things like soap, things that we now take for granted, soap, socks, were really for the privileged few. The king was the only one who could actually bath, on a daily basis or use soap.
You're talking about bathing. You know how I'm just going to give you a brief anecdote. Mm-hmm. The expression, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Because everybody had to.
Do you know how that how that came about? Like poor families basically took a bath, once or twice a year, and they so the head of the family would start, and then everybody would bath in that same bath water. So by the time you got to the baby, right, this water was so filthy you could actually lose a baby in the bath and throw it out with the bath water. Like this used to literally happen. Hence the expression. Right? That's how poor people were.
300 years ago. And now we have toilets in our houses. We have bathrooms in our homes. If you really think about it, that is what capitalism is all about. And if you look at Zimbabwe, half of Zimbabwe's society still does not have toilets, still doesn't have, shower, doesn't have decent water in their homes. And those are the things that we need to address. And the only way we can address them is through savings and through investments. So it then brings us to the question of how do nations become wealthy? I mean, this was, Adam Smith's book. and maybe we can talk about it. So how do we become a wealthy nation? We've established that we're a poor nation, but what do we need to do? What are the steps that we need to do to become a wealthy nation?
So we need to do a full throttled embrace of free market capitalism, right? And that means that we need to create a macroeconomic environment in which entrepreneurs thrive, in which foreign capital finds Zimbabwe an attractive investment destination. And so, there's some low-hanging fruit in Zimbabwe. We have an incredibly rich natural resource endowment.
Yeah, I don't buy that. Almost every country is endowed with natural resources.
So the difference.
So I really don't buy that.
Yeah, but the difference between a country like Venezuela, which has the world's largest oil reserves, they've got more than 300 billion barrels of oil.
More than Saudi.
Yeah, they're not even in the world's top 10 oil producers. Okay. And the US has much less reserves than most of the huge producers, but they are number one in oil production. So why is Venezuela not producing that much oil? Why are they poor? Because none of the major multinational oil companies are interested in exploiting the resource there. And as long as oil is somewhere in the ground, it's worthless. It doesn't matter how much of it you have, right? So when we sit here and we say, oh, well, we've got all this lithium, we've got all this diamonds and whatever mineral it is, it actually doesn't matter if it's in the ground and not being exploited.
Who's better at exploiting it? Is it government? Because government they raise taxes. We raise about 3.5 billion. They could put up a bond, an international bond, get $20 billion, ceteris paribus, all things being equal, and they could exploit these resources. Why do we think that private sector is best suited at exploiting these resources and not government?
So if you look at the historical record, and this is not just true in Zimbabwe and in Africa, but across the world, governments are generally not great at doing things. Their capacity to get things done is just poor. So even in the world's wealthiest countries, like the United States of America, for example, private healthcare is better than public healthcare. Private education is better than public education. Pretty much everything that is done by both the government and the private sector does it better, right? And, philosophically, the reason why this is the case is the skin in the game issue. Because if you're running your business and whether you do it well or not affect how much money ends up in your pocket, you have a vested interest in the success of your business, right? And also, if you're a poor businessman, your business is going to crash and burn and it's not going to be in the market anymore.
The losses are privatized.
Yes. Whereas with governments, firstly, governments are eternal monopolies. They can be run incredibly badly and still exist, right? You can't run a private enterprise badly and exist indefinitely. You will.
Good point.
Right? And secondly, a lot of bureaucrats don't have skin in the game. So if you are running the Ministry of Education, for example, and you're a phenomenal operator, right? You get things done, you achieve amazing outcomes. Do you become incredibly wealthy?
No.
Unless
you're corrupt. In fact, you're pushed to become corrupt, actually.
Right? And if you're an atrocious administrator, if you have absolutely abysmal outcomes, if you've got, are you going to become poorer? No, right? So you don't have skin in the game. Your performance and your quality of life, there is no
correlation,
connection, right? So this is why governments generally across the world are bad at doing things.
I can add to that and say that the nature of government is it's this huge enterprise, behemoth, and there's absolutely no way that it can be good at doing that many things at the same time. calculating and ensuring that you have a bureaucracy that can run private business or that can actually create wealth is almost impossible just by the nature of it. But also, I think that governments were formed for a particular reason. There was a social contract, and that social contract had nothing to do with business. In fact, the social contract was for government to actually protect business, because government actually acknowledged that they were not the best at exploiting these resources. And it's better for these resources to be exploited by somebody who is single-minded, that is their business. They wake up in the morning and that is their business. Not somebody who wakes up in the morning and has to look at international news to see what's actually happening in Ukraine. And then in the evening, they have to go to a charity because, that's what
their schedule says.
Yeah, exactly. Like they're not involved in business management. And I do not understand why bureaucracies, and especially politicians, believe that they can run businesses better. Because, to your point, it's very simple and straightforward. If a minister or politician could actually run or could be efficient and run business well, they would not be a politician. They would be in business. Because only in business is their outcome directly correlating to their output. Mm-hmm. Right? So their income is directly related to how much wealth they're creating. Whereas when you're in government, there's a disconnect. I often use this, it's anecdotal, but it's a very good example, because we get to hear these arguments continuously about how if you stop corruption or illicit flows, then you can take that money and direct it to free education and free healthcare, right? And this is my anecdote, right? Is imagine a policeman that stops a bank heist. So there's a bank heist in First Street, somewhere, one of those banks in First Street, and they stop the bank heist. Let's say they serve the bank $100 million US. Let's consider that, which was in the vault. So it was hard gold and cash and jewelry in the vault. Mm-hmm. And our courageous policeman stops that from happening. Does it mean that the policeman certainly has $100 million US that he can then give away? Or does it mean that government certainly has $100 million US? Or what's likely to happen is they will take it from the thief
and give it to its rightful owner.
And they will put it back into the vault.
Yes.
And what they will get is a pat on the back and perhaps a smile. Mm-hmm. Right? They're just doing their job.
If they're lucky, they might get a bottle of whiskey.
Well, they cannot. According to the rules, they cannot even get any gift. But the principle is, just because you stopped corruption and you stopped illicit flows, all you've just done is you stopped a thief from coming into my home. Mm-hmm. It does not mean that the TV suddenly becomes the state's TV. It's not. Yeah. So anyone who's putting out a manifesto and arguing that we will stop illicit flows, we will stop corruption, and because of that, we will earn X amount, and because we've earned X amount, we can redirect it to education or healthcare. That is simply not true. The other thing is, there's again another economic argument that if you stop illicit flows, if you stop corruption, then your tax will increase. Again, I give you the example of a heist, a bank heist. If you put back the money in the vault, do your taxes increase?
No, of course not. So it speaks to another thing about the way we conceptualize corruption and service in government. So there's this idea that when you're in government, you're serving your people, which is noble. But then because you're serving your people, you shouldn't actually be remunerated well, And I think that's a fallacy. And certainly, if you look at the historical record, one of the great ideas from Lee Kuan Yew in his Singapore story is that he recognized that civil servants should be richly rewarded. If you want the best people to work in government, the rewards, the financial rewards of your job in government should be similar to what you would earn if you were doing well in the private sector. So he linked the remuneration of top civil servants to the remuneration of top lawyers in private practice to CEOs in private practice. So somebody who was a high-level CEO, a very successful lawyer, would actually consider going into government because they're not taking a hit financially. And if people are compensated richly, they're much less interested in corruption. I mean, if you think about it in the context of, say, South Africa and Cyril, right? His net worth is more than $400 million US. How much money would you need to bribe that guy? You know, so, and if you have a whole government of people that don't need corruption to fund, you know, the quality of life that they want, then you'll have a lot less corruption.
I tend to differ slightly with the Lee Kuan Yew proposal. I think that if you have the wrong people in government, then even a hefty salary is just not going to stop them. You know, and government, the nature of the state is that it invites people.
The wrong kind of people.
The wrong kind of people. That's the problem. So the only way you can solve it is through open market system, a free market. Because when you have a free market, then you disabuse the system of monopolies. Because remember, the only reason why politicians make money is because they're a gatekeeper. It's like a toll gate. That's essentially the reason why they make money.
Which is why you want your government to be small, right?
Exactly.
So basically, there's this concept in accounting that I think you're familiar with, but for the benefit of the audience, called zero accounting. You know, so if you are thinking about your budget going forward, and you want to make sure that you're being as efficient and effective as possible, one of the hacks they have is to take a blank sheet of paper, right, and not actually look at your historical expenses and say, look, to run this business going forward, what is absolutely indispensable, you know, in terms of costs and expenses, and you start from scratch without looking at what you've historically been paying for and having as expenses. And the idea is that you might actually come up with less line items than you had previously and enjoy huge savings. And I think that that idea is applicable in thinking about government. You know, if you and me were to reconceptualize a government from scratch, from a blank piece of paper, what ministries would we actually put in there, and why? I suspect.
Let me give you another empirical evidence just to support your point, and why this beast called the state or called government is something that it's going to be very difficult to actually reduce it. Let me give you a very good example. Did you know that, and we use America as a empirical evidence, that tax was actually introduced, income tax was only introduced in 1913.
Yes, before that it was less than 1%.
Yeah, it was a percent, actually, on the 3rd of October, 1913. I remember the 3rd of October because that's my birthday. And that's when income tax was actually introduced. And people rioted, right? Mm-hmm. But the claim of the government of the day was this was necessary, but government bureaucracy would not increase, right? By the time you get to 1943, the tax had actually increased to over 20%, right? But this is curious. Government had increased 10 times during that period, right? So the problem with government, as we were saying, is because government does not make losses. So there is absolutely no incentive whatsoever to cut government and to become smaller. Mm-hmm. There is no incentive whatsoever. Every bureaucrat that gets in, the first thing that they want to do is to increase their span of control, increase the number of things that they're actually doing. But remember, they're incompetent, because anyone who's competent should ideally be in the private sector. The only reason why you're in government is because you're actually incompetent, right? So you have a state that is incompetent and run by bureaucrats who are incompetent, now telling business how to run business. I think that's problematic. So while I agree with you, I think that you're not addressing the core issue, that you have people with vested interest to ensure that the government is actually big. And the only people who can change are the voters, I believe. They're the only people who can change is if we change the culture. So what we really need to do is to change the culture. That actually we don't need these freebies. If people insisted on employment and not freebies, then government is forced to have a small government. If people insist in their communities that schools must come back to be communities, to their particular control, certainly, do you realize that the civil service would reduce by half if teachers were employed by the communities and not by government? But that insistence can only come from the communities themselves. So if we want a small government, we're going to have to start mobilizing from a community basis where we take over the schools. I mean, I find it ridiculous that you have a school like, Borodo Primary School or Greystone Primary School or Highlands Primary School, prime real estate, great buildings, great infrastructure, but being restricted by some bureaucrat who sits, somewhere far away from what's actually happening at these schools, telling them how many classes they should have and how much they should pay and what sort of fees they should charge. I find it ridiculous. If Highlands or Borodo were back to their communities, those schools will be able to actually increase the uptake of students. You will have 100, you'll have 10 times or 10 classes in a stream, because now they're able to sustain it. And I think that's the critical thing that we need to talk about.
Yeah, look, I completely agree with you. I don't understand why the government is in the business of education at all. I think if it were up to me, they would just be a regulator, and the private sector would create products for the market based on what the market wants and can afford. And we've actually run this experiment in Zimbabwe over the last few decades of a huge portfolio being run by the state of schools, and the results are in year after year after year after year, and it's been abysmal. We've produced appalling results for a country that claims to care deeply about education. And I think that, it's a skin in the game problem. If you have schools run by bureaucrats and not by communities and parents, you're going to get abysmal results, because there is no upside for the bureaucrat to do a good job. Their default setting is to be indifferent. So certainly, that's true for education, and it's also true for healthcare. Sadly,
no, absolutely. Can we go to business? What sort of climate? What's the capitalist manifesto as far as business is concerned? What would you do in the next 5 years in Zimbabwe?
So, firstly, small government. Blank piece of paper. What business should the government of the day actually be engaged in? It should not be in the education business. It should not be in the healthcare business. It should not be running any parastatals. Those should all be auctioned. And what?
So privatize all the parastatals.
Yeah, well, privatize is a fancy word. We should just auction. We should just sell them. If nobody's interested in buying them, then they should be shut down. Why are they on the government's books? Firstly, they have been losing money for decades, so they're basically bleeding the state. And are they providing a public good that is indispensable? If let's say we auctioned Air Zimbabwe, and there were no takers, right? And we liquidated it. Is there going to be a huge public outcry that, oh my gosh, we don't have a national airline? I can't fly to Joburg anymore. I can't fly. Nobody cares, right? So this thing is basically a net negative for the country, right? It's bleeding us month in, month out. So why are we in the business of owning a national airline? It doesn't make any sense to me, So the parastatals, certainly we should just get rid of them. Either sell them if there's somebody willing to pay more than $1 for any of them, fantastic. If there isn't, just shut them down. So you want a government that's as small as possible, that's only engaged in things that a state should be engaged in: foreign policy, national defense, those
National
sort of
security.
those sort of things, But everything else, why do you have a state-subsidized agriculture program? The farmers should sort themselves out. It's not the state's business, in my view. So you want a maximally small and efficient government that is only engaged in things that the private sector can't do.
So I would add to that and say that policy must be engaged around savings and investment. So you want a small government, but one that is really geared around investment, because they totally understand that if you have investment, then we're actually going to get the job numbers. You're going to get, in fact, the entire population should actually be employed, or entrepreneurs should actually be coming up, and they should be protected. So that's really the essence of government, is actually to protect.
To savings and investments, one of the things that the government should not be engaged in, for sure, is running a currency. Okay,
agreed.
We have over the last 20 years demonstrated that it is not one of our core competencies, issuing and managing local currency. We should just get out of that business completely. So I like your idea of a currency board, but even that, if we do go that route, we shouldn't be managing it.
Yeah, someone else must.
Right, yeah. And an institution like the Reserve Bank should really be more like
a regulator.
A regulator of banks. The South Africans have the central bank and a bank regulator. They've separated those roles. So that's one of the huge challenges for savings and investment in Zim. It's the currency of the day, right? Because you cannot plan anything long term.
So throughout history, what the sad bit is? It's the idea of a currency and attaching a currency to some sort of patriotism or sovereignty it's a very new idea. It's like 1971. Mm-hmm. It's a very, very new idea, and I don't know why we would attach ourselves to a currency, and why a government of the day would want to attach itself to a particular currency. I mean, I would love to attach myself to the flag, more to my flag than to my currency. Currency, it's actually inimical to patriotism. I don't even understand it, because throughout history, a nation's pride was never in its currency. Mm-hmm. It's actually a new phenomenon. And another statistic that will shock you is, of all the currencies that have been introduced, half of them are no longer available.
They failed.
And most fail. Those that have failed within a 15-year period. But what it does is it distorts our savings and investment climate. So I think that we've showed that we cannot run a currency, and there is absolutely no patriotic verve that comes with having a Zim dollar. What we must be interested in is jobs. So if, again, I put this dichotomy to our audience, if you had to choose between option 1, having your own currency, or option 2, creating jobs, which would you rather have?
We want jobs, for sure. I think Zimbabweans have been so traumatized by local currency issues. The Germans, after they had their awful bout of hyperinflation, decided to make it a criminal offense for people in government to take policy action that would result in hyperinflation, right? And I think that we should actually, if we're going to transform and from being poor to being rich, we can never have hyperinflation again. And I think we really need to apply our minds into creating a framework where we make it clear to not just ourselves as citizens, but to the world, that you will never be molested by hyperinflation. And if we don't have such a framework, then you can't plan long term, right? If you don't know what the currency of the day is going to be in 3 months or 6 months, or what?
It turns out, so, for the last, let's call it, 13 years, we've been changing currency every other 4 years. And it turns out that we're about to introduce another currency.
ZIG. I mean,
is it ZIG or is it ZG? I mean, it's mind blowing.
It's an outrage.
Here you have, a policymaker who's deciding that we need another currency, as if we're short of currency. And this is the thing that I think that bothers me quite greatly is, do we as society care if, as long as we're creating jobs, do we care whether it's Zim dollar, it's Rand, it's US dollar, it's bond note? Do we actually care? But what we do care is we've mismanaged the Zim dollar. We've mismanaged our local currency. And we do not deserve to be managing a currency whatsoever. That's number one. Number two is the reality of where we're going in the world. I mean, very soon, the EU, they don't have their individual currency. And they're okay. They still function. So why should we as Zimbabwe, not even as Africa, because where Africa is going, if you look at where East Africa is going, where West Africa, they've got the CFA franc. East Africa, they're coming up with their own currency. Southern Africa, we've got the Rand and, a number of
which
countries.
Which is used by about 4 countries.
About 4 countries already. So the idea of having your own currency is archaic. I mean, it's becoming more and more redundant. So why can't we, at this particular stage, especially in the next 5 years, because that's the thing that's going to encourage investors to come to Zimbabwe. If they know for certain that for the next 10 years or 20 years, we guarantee that we're not going to introduce a Zim dollar currency. That is what we want, because that risk is now systemic to Zimbabwe. It's not systemic to a lot of other countries, or if it is, not to the extent that it is in Zimbabwe. So any investor who thinks of Zimbabwe, they think, okay, so what currency is in use? That's what they're thinking. And if we want our capital markets to work, if we want people to take their money out of the mattresses and back into the capital markets, what we need to ensure is we do not give them that headache of Zim dollars again. So it has to go. It has to go. And the third thing that I would argue about investment is about what makes Zimbabwe unique. So what makes Zimbabwe unique is not the number of resources that we have. Almost every country has some level of resource. But it's actually rule of law. If you think about it, a lot of people end up in the US or in the UK primarily because they believe their money is safe there. In fact, a lot of the people in Zimbabwe take their money, so they're extremely corrupt, and they take the money to Dubai. Why? Because they actually believe that there is rule of law, that their money is safe. And I think that what we need to do, because we've dabbled in this from 1965, where we actually do not believe in rule of law. So it's not just post-independence, even pre-independence, we have continuously showed that we do not believe in the rule of law. So the question is, how do we ingratiate, or how do we inculcate that culture of rule of law? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think the solution to that is an independent judiciary. And the model that I would be inspired by is the American model, where at a certain level in their federal courts, they have lifetime appointments, right? So you can't fire this guy. And the way they are administered is independent of the executive branch. So they can't be starved of funding, and they can't be fired. So once you are a judge at a certain level, you're independent, and you can't be bullied by politicians. And that's why there's a lot of confidence in that legal system, notwithstanding its challenges. So you wanted a system that's independent, not just, so if you have an independent system that engenders the faith and confidence of the market, you can then become a safe investment destination.
I tend to differ. I think that lifetime appointments, that's not the thing that's critical in the American system. The thing that's critical in the American system is that the individual rights are actually protected by the Constitution. right? So it doesn't matter, even a judge cannot take away the rights that are enshrined in the Constitution or even in the values of that particular society. A judge cannot take away those rights, right? So I think that that's what's critical. So it doesn't matter whether it's a lifetime judge or a term judge, but as long as whoever is in the judiciary cannot take away your fundamental rights, that's number one. And we can get into what are those fundamental rights, but I don't think that's, for this particular scope. But the second thing that I want to highlight is about separation of powers. So what we tend to find in Africa is high concentration of power in our government, where the government is actually running business, it's running the judiciary, it's running everything, right? Mm-hmm. And I think Friedrich Hayek clearly showed that it's almost impossible to be efficient, right, when you're running everything. So what's critical is separation of powers. And by separation of powers, we mean that we must empower judiciary, and they must have equal power as our executive, as our parliament. And I think what we've seen over time in Zimbabwe is that parliament is actually weak. Our parliamentarians also are not as, strong and credible as they should be. And a lot of laws the executive now rules by SIs, whereas that power really should be with parliament. So I would say that, or I would ask that we empower our parliament, that the executive is already the most powerful institution in our government, and that is problematic. And we want to see it becoming smaller, but also its power. We want to take away as much power as we can from them.
I actually was thinking about it the other day, and it occurred to me that we probably erred, at a national level in, I think it was in the late 1980s, when we transitioned from a parliamentary system to having an executive presidency. Because firstly, it's just much more expensive to run elections where you have a separate presidential ballot, and secondly, it speaks to what you were just talking about in terms of the concentration of power. If you look at the UK, which has a parliamentary system, whoever's prime minister has to be in lockstep with the majority in parliament. And the moment you lose their confidence, you get fired. Which is why over the last 5, 6, 7 years, we've been through 4 or 5 UK prime ministers. And that's a great thing. Because
and the system is still intact.
Because it's much more sensitive to the prevailing mood in parliament, right? So the executive branch actually has much less power, and I think that's something that
I agree, and I would go even further because of the history of Europe, and especially Europe, is that they have espoused this idea of proportional representation. So their democracy is proportionate. So it's not about ruling. It's not a winner takes all system. It's a system where you rule in proportion to how many votes you get. So it's very inclusive, primarily because of their history. But I think that the checkered history of Zimbabwe and the tribal connotations in Zimbabwe, the regionalism connotations in Zimbabwe, I think that what's best, and this dichotomy of opposition and ruling, what is actually best would be proportional representation, where even though you're not in the executive, but you have a great say in what the executive says because you are proportionally represented somewhat. So yes, you lost the election, you didn't get the 50 plus, but you have a big constituency. It could be 20% or 25%. And that 25% has very unique needs. The idea that it's not represented in government, I find it problematic. The other thing is, what I would do is provide an off-ramp for a lot of our politicians. I think that as Zimbabwe, we have failed to provide an off-ramp for a lot of these politicians, and they feel an innate need to die in power, primarily because of their history, what has happened to them from corruption or other things that they feel that they have to hold on to power by whatever means. And as a society, societies that do very well are societies that recognize that there are crimes, that there are issues around corruption, that there are issues around whatever it is, but we must provide an off-ramp for people. And an off-ramp, I would assume it this way. It's a way in which we can get our leaders a dignified exit, that their wealth is intact, that we're not going to go after them, right? And we must inculcate that, as you say, your accounting term, that what is more important is going forward, right? So for every reason, there's every reason for us to look at what has happened in the past and what we got wrong in the past, but what's more important is going forward. And when you look at societies like the UK and the US, they provide excellent off-ramps. If you look at Obama went into the Oval Office and he was a poor man by all accounts. I don't think he had $5 in his pocket. But today he is an extremely wealthy man. Tony Blair, you provide these off-ramps where their foundations. Tony Blair, again, was another particular labor lawyer who had absolutely nothing when he went into government, but now he's worth over, 150 million pounds. But his impact in society is even greater beyond his time in office. But look at what's happening in Zimbabwe. Look at Maimujuru. Look at Didmus Mutasa. It's a sad story. And I know that in social media and newspaper, we tend to laugh at these individuals. But what we're doing is we're creating anxiety amongst the people who are still in government. And what we need to do as society is we need to provide these exits. And these exits are such that people can move on with their lives. So I'm actually quite happy with a scenario where, in fact, all our government bureaucrats who've served in government for a very long time, we must retire them. They must have their farms, they must be given title deeds, and they must be given some sort of pension where we fund at least one crop of theirs every year, and they can spend time with their grandkids. We put them in our boards, we put them, let's elevate them. Because I think that the problem that we have as a society is we haven't elevated post-government life. So that's why you find 80-year-olds, 90-year-olds still sticking in government and still sticking to power. It's very possible, because this is the reality that we need to put. And this thought was, at some point, about 20 years ago, I had a conversation with Strive. And he impressed upon me a principle that I have kept for a very long time. And he said that a prosperous society does not have one pinnacle. A prosperous society has many pinnacles. So there are many ways in which you can get to the top and in which you can be celebrated. So if you look at even the celebrity culture in America, the Hollywood culture, is this idea that you can be prosperous and you can be famous and you can be right at the pinnacle of society, and it's got nothing to do with government. Mm-hmm. Whereas when you come to Zim society, the church, for example, we should have, particular instances where our archbishop is celebrated, has the fame, has the money, has the power. Our business people, similarly with our business people, it must be okay to be a businessman, to become celebrated, rich, powerful, and it's perfectly fine. That's your contribution to Zim society. Last anecdote before you come in.
Yeah, sure.
Which I find very interesting, right? Is the number of people I've met, Zimbabweans, who fashion themselves as the next president. It's amazing. I'm like, really? You know that we have perhaps maybe 1 million prospective presidents?
As many as 1 million, that sounds fanciful.
I'm telling you, almost everybody I come across, like they have this idea that they are God-chosen or smarter or whatever, and they're going to change society because they're going to be the president. And I think that's fundamentally wrong. We should celebrate our arts, we should celebrate our writers, we should celebrate as many avenues as possible so that they rise up to the pinnacle of society, and we celebrate them, and it's perfectly fine. And they can see themselves and they can see their life beyond just the presidency. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. I completely agree. I think certainly politicians should actually look forward to retirement, to life outside of the hustle of politics. They should have the peace of mind that they're not going to be prosecuted or abused. They should be able to walk peacefully into the sunset and enjoy that next chapter of their lives. And that's certainly how it works in every successful society. Like if you want to envision a rich Zimbabwe, right? That has to be true here as well. And I think it's a mindset that we need to affect. And because we're a small, poor country, if you think about other smaller countries on the world stage, like Switzerland, right? The average Swiss citizen doesn't know or care who's running the country at the time, because things work. And they're able to get on with their lives and pursue their dreams and aspirations without actually being overly concerned about the politics of the day. Whereas you find in this part of the world, if you want to get people very emotional quickly, talk about politics. And to me, what that says is that we've got a problem, because it's actually shouldn't be all that important. You should be more engaged in your life at a micro level, and the politics of the day should not be a subject to be emotional about at all. So for sure, that's if we are able to make our government much smaller, much less important in the public's imagination, I think that will be a big win.
Fantastic. Well, there you have it, folks. I hope that we've managed to convince you on our capitalist manifesto, or at least get the conversation going. This is something that we totally believe in. We don't think that we can change society immediately, but what we want and why we started Friday Drinks is so that we affect the culture in our society. If we change the people, if we change the culture, politics is downstream culture. So that's the reason why we're on this particular platform. And I hope that we've managed to convince you to come with us on this capitalist manifesto, and we start pushing these ideas to our policymakers, to our politicians, especially at this particular point in time, so that the next 5 years or 10 years, or in fact the next 50 years, we can have a prosperous society. Otherwise, let's have your views differ with us. That's perfectly fine. That's one of the hallmarks of a free society, right?
Yeah, we enjoyed the debate and discussion.
Absolutely. Otherwise, have yourself a wonderful Heroes weekend. We will certainly have a joyous one.
For sure.
Cheers.